There is a river in the American Midwest where something is happening that no engineer designed and no committee approved. Beneath the brown water, in the slack pools and shaded backwaters, an old order is quietly reasserting itself. For years, people fought a war here with money and machinery. They built walls of electricity, they counted the cost in hundreds of millions. And all the while, beneath their boats, an answer was taking shape in a language far older than money. This is the Illinois River. It runs for roughly 270 miles through the heart of the continent, draining the farm country of the Midwest and bending north toward the largest body of fresh water on Earth. For most of its history, it was an unremarkable working river. Barges moved grain along it. Towns grew up on its banks. Fishermen pulled catfish from its channels and thought little about the world beneath the surface. Then, sometime in the early 1980s, that world began to change. And the change began far away, with a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. In the 1970s, fish farms and water treatment plants across the southern United States had a problem. Their ponds were choking on algae and weeds. So they imported a solution from the rivers of East Asia. 4 species of large carp, silver carp and bighead carp, which strain tiny floating plankton from the water by the mouthful. Grass carp, which mow down aquatic plants. And black carp, which crush snails and mussels with throat teeth strong enough to grind shell. These fish were living filters. They were efficient, cheap, and astonishingly good at their job. For a few years, they stayed where they were put. Then the rivers rose. Floods are the oldest story the Mississippi Basin tells, and when the floodwaters came, they spilled over the banks of the ponds and carried the carp out into open water. What followed was not a trickle, but a takeover. These fish had escaped into a continent with no defenses against them. The waters of the Mississippi and its tributaries were warm, slow, and rich with exactly the food they were built to eat. There were no predators here that had evolved alongside them. There was nothing to tell them no. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the silver carp itself. A grown silver carp can reach more than 3 feet in length and weigh over 60 pounds. It feeds almost constantly, filtering plankton from the water with a specialized sieve in its gills. Plankton is not just fish food, it is the base of the entire river food web. Every native fish, from the smallest minnow to the young of the largest predator, depends on it, either directly or one link up the chain. When silver carp arrive in numbers, they do not simply join the community. They strip its foundation bare. And they arrived in numbers almost beyond belief. In some stretches of the Illinois River, silver carp came to make up the overwhelming majority of all the fish in the water, measured not in individuals but in tons per river mile. A native fish trying to make a living in that river was now competing for food against a wall of imported mouths that never stopped feeding. Mussel beds thinned, native fish grew slower and fewer. The river was still full of life, but it was the wrong life, and it was crowding everything else toward the edges. Then there was the other problem, the one that made the silver carp famous. They jump. When a boat motor passes overhead, the vibration sends them into a panic, and they hurl themselves out of the water by the dozens, silver bodies the size of small dogs flying through the air. People have been knocked unconscious. Boaters have had bones broken and windshields shattered. Videos of the spectacle spread across the internet and turned the silver carp into a kind of monster, a punchline and a menace at the same time. But the jumping was only the visible symptom of something far more serious happening below. Because there was a door at the top of this river, and behind it lay a prize the carp could not be allowed to reach. The Illinois River connects, through a network of canals around Chicago, to Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan is one of the Great Lakes, which together hold 1/5 of all the fresh surface water on the planet and support a fishing economy worth billions of dollars every year. If silver carp and bighead carp reached the Great Lakes and established themselves there, the damage could be permanent and immense. The river had become a front line, and the people charged with defending it began to spend. What they spent is the number at the heart of this story. By the year 2020, federal and state agencies had poured close to $600 million into managing and containing these fish, and the researchers who calculated that figure were careful to say it was almost certainly an underestimate. The single largest piece of it was infrastructure. Far down the Illinois waterway, near the town of Joliet, sits a place called Brandon Road. Here, engineers designed a gauntlet of deterrents to stop carp in their tracks. A wall of electricity in the water, curtains of bubbles, underwater speakers blasting sound, flushing channels to sweep tiny fish back downstream. The cost of the Brandon Road project alone has been projected at more than $1 billion and years of construction. Upstream, closer to the lake, an electric barrier already hummed beneath the surface of the canal, a last line of defense charged to turn back any carp that tried to pass. And along hundreds of miles of river, state agencies hired commercial fishermen to do the oldest job there is: to catch fish. They paid bounties, they ran contract crews with nets stretched across the carp's gathering places. And the haul was staggering. Over the past 15 years, crews removed roughly 50 million pounds of invasive carp from the Illinois River. Count in the independent commercial catch over a quarter century, and the total climbs past 100 million pounds. 50 million pounds is the weight of about 5,000 elephants, pulled from a single river, one net at a time. It worked in the way that holding a line works. In the upper pools of the river, closest to Lake Michigan, the relentless removal pushed carp densities down and held the front in place, miles short of the door to the Great Lakes. This was not a victory, it was a siege, and an expensive one, the kind that has no end as long as the enemy keeps breeding. An invasive carp breed like almost nothing else. A single female can release hundreds of thousands, even millions of eggs in a season. Stop the pressure for even a little while, and the population comes roaring back. The people fighting this war understood something sobering. They could contain the carp. They could not, by spending alone, defeat them. But here is where the story turns. Because to understand what came back to this river, you first have to understand what was lost from it. Long before the carp arrived, before the electric barriers and the bounties, the Illinois River and the wider Mississippi Basin held a different kind of power. They held predators. Great, ancient, native predators that had ruled these waters for millions of years. And over the last century, one by one, we had pushed them to the margins or out of existence entirely. We did not just leave the river undefended against the carp, we had spent generations dismantling its defenses ourselves. The first of those defenders is a fish most people have never given a second thought. The blue catfish. In the rivers of its native basin, the blue catfish is a giant. It can exceed 100 pounds, with a mouth like a cavern and an appetite to match. For most of the time these fish shared the water with invasive carp, scientists assumed the two simply passed each other by. No one had ever documented a native fish in the Mississippi Basin eating an adult big-headed carp. The carp grew too large, too fast, for almost anything to swallow. It seemed they had grown beyond the reach of the food web they had invaded. Then a team of researchers went looking in exactly the right place. In a quiet backwater of the Mississippi River near Alton, Illinois, they captured blue catfish and examined what was inside them. What they found rewrote the assumption. Adult silver carp were not a minor item in these catfish. They were the single most important prey by weight in the catfish diet. Silver carp turned up in the stomachs of 70% of the fish examined. Here was a native predator, large enough and bold enough to swallow the invader whole, and it was doing exactly that, in the heart of the invasion, without anyone telling it to. The blue catfish had simply looked at this strange new abundance of food and recognized it for what it was. A meal. That is the thing about a true heavyweight. The reason almost no native fish could eat adult carp is a matter of geometry. It takes an enormous mouth to engulf a fish 3 feet long. The blue catfish has that mouth. And in the Mississippi Basin, where it has always belonged, it represents one of the only native answers to the largest carp of all. It does not need to be stocked or managed or coaxed. It only needs to be allowed to be what it already is. A predator. At the top of its river, doing the work no barrier can do for nothing. The second defender carries a far heavier history, and it is the emotional center of this story. The alligator gyar. To look at one is to look back in time. It can grow to 8 feet long and weigh more than 300 pounds, armored in scales so hard that early settlers used them as arrowheads, with a long snout lined with 2 rows of teeth. It is one of the largest freshwater fish in North America, a living relic of an age when giants ruled these rivers. And of all the native fish in the basin, the alligator gar holds a unique distinction. It is widely regarded as the only native species truly capable of preying on fully grown adult invasive carp. And we nearly wiped it out. For most of the 20th century, the alligator gar was despised. It was called a trash fish, a nuisance, a destroyer of game fish, and it was hunted and killed on sight with that justification. Across its northern range, it vanished. In the state of Illinois, the last alligator gar was caught in the year 1966 in a southern stream called the Cache River. After that, nothing. By the 1990s, the alligator gar was declared extinct in Illinois, gone from the very waters where it had hunted for thousands of years. The river's single greatest native predator of large fish had been erased by our own hand, decades before the carp ever arrived to take its place. Then, slowly, came regret, and the will to make it right. Beginning in the year 2010, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, working with federal partners, started bringing the alligator gar home. They raised young gar in hatcheries, fed from broodfish collected in the lower Mississippi, and released them back into the southern Illinois waters their ancestors had ruled. From 2010 through 2025, biologists stocked more than 21,000 alligator gar into a dozen bodies of water across the state. They tagged the fish, they tracked them, and year by year, the giant began to return to a river that had forgotten it. Now, the people leading this work are careful, and honesty demands that we be careful too. The biologists who restored the alligator gar will tell you plainly that they did not bring it back to fight the carp. They brought it back to undo an old extinction, to restore a missing piece of a living system, to return an ancient predator to the place where it belonged. And they are equally clear that the GAR, on its own, will never grow numerous enough to wipe out invasive carp. Carp are measured in tons per river mile. Gar are still being counted in the thousands. No one is pretending that a few restored giants can end an invasion of this scale, but that honesty is exactly what makes the story matter. Because the alligator gar does eat carp. It is a predator built precisely for large, soft-bodied, open-water fish, and the rivers are now full of exactly that. As the gar grows and spreads and reclaims its old range, it adds one more pressure, one more mouth at the very top of the food web, pushing back against the invader from a direction no electric barrier can. The gar is not a weapon we deployed. It is a defender we exiled and are now welcoming home. And in coming home, it is quietly resuming a job it held for 10,000 years. The third defender is the oldest of them all, the bowfin. If the gar is ancient, the bowfin is almost beyond reckoning. It is the sole survivor of a lineage of fish that stretches back more than 150 million years to the age of the dinosaurs. Every other member of its ancient order is known only from fossils. The bowfin alone still swims in the swamps and sluggish backwaters of North America, looking very much as its relatives did when giant reptiles walked the shore. It can even breathe air, gulping oxygen at the surface with a primitive lung, which lets it survive in warm, stagnant water where other fish suffocate and die. It is an ambush predator, cylindrical and powerful, with a broad, bony head and a mouth full of sharp teeth. It lies still in the weeds and the flooded timber, and it strikes at passing fish in less than 1/10 of a second. And it lives in precisely the places that matter most in this story. The quiet backwaters, the oxbows, the weedy margins, the slack creek mouths where the river slows. Because those backwaters are exactly where young invasive carp settle and grow. The carp lay their drifting eggs in the open current, but the larvae and juveniles ride the water downstream and gather in the very nurseries the bowfin calls home. And the bowfin, like the gar, was once a hated fish. For most of the last century, it was dismissed as a worthless trash fish, killed by anglers who blamed it for eating their bass and crappie. We were wrong about that too. The bowfin is not a destroyer of game fish. It is a balancer, an opportunistic predator that feeds on whatever small fish are most abundant in its patch of water. And in a backwater now seething with juvenile carp, the most abundant small fish on the menu is increasingly the invader itself. The living fossil, lurking in the shadows of the swamp, has quietly added the river's newest problem to its very old diet. The bowfin does not act alone in those nurseries. It is part of a chorus. When researchers examined what was eating juvenile carp in the Illinois River, they found the young invaders turning up in the stomachs of a long list of native fish: largemouth bass, white bass, black crappie, channel catfish, freshwater drum, yellow perch, short-nosed gar. One species after another, the river's ordinary residents had begun to treat baby carp as just another thing to eat. Some of them, the white bass and the crappie and the short-nosed gar, actually seemed to prefer the young carp, choosing them over native prey even as they became harder to find. Scientists have a name for what is happening here. They call it biotic resistance. It is the capacity of a native ecosystem to push back against an invader through its own living machinery, through hunger and predation and competition, without any help from us. And the honest truth about biotic resistance, the truth the researchers are careful to state, is that on its own, it is rarely enough to defeat a flood of invaders this large. The carp grow too fast. By their second year, a silver carp has outgrown the mouths of most of its predators. The bass and the crappie can eat the babies, but they cannot touch the giants. So this is not the story of three fish single-handedly winning a war that $600 million could not. That story would be a lie, and you would be right to distrust it. What is actually happening is quieter, and in its way more profound. The river is doing what living systems do when given the chance. It is adapting. The blue catfish at the top end is learning to swallow the adults. The returning gar is reclaiming the role of giant. The bowfin and the bass and the crappie are thinning the young in the nurseries. None of them is the answer by itself. Together, they are something the engineers could never build. A river that has begun to eat its own invader. And the numbers, slowly, are beginning to bend. In the upper pools of the Illinois River, the combination of all this pressure, the relentless human removal, and the steady appetite of the natives has driven carp densities down far enough that scientists can measure the river starting to recover. In those upper reaches, the plankton that the carp had stripped away has begun to return, which means the foundation of the food web is rebuilding from the bottom up. The front line has held miles from Lake Michigan. The door to the Great Lakes is still closed, and in the water below, the defenders we once exiled are taking back their places. There is a lesson in this river, and it is worth carrying with you. For a long time, we believed that the way to fix a broken ecosystem was to engineer it, to build the wall, fund the program, deploy the technology, and impose our solution from the outside. And sometimes that is exactly what is needed. The electric barriers and the removal crews bought this river precious time, and without them, the carp might already be loose in the Great Lakes. But the Illinois River is teaching us something the budgets could not. That the deepest and most durable defense an ecosystem has is the one it grows itself. Restore the predators. Bring back the giants we drove away. Stop killing the living fossil we called a trash fish. And the system begins, slowly, to heal along lines far older than any plan we could draw. Think of what that alligator gar represents. A century ago, we looked at the largest native predator in the river and decided it was worthless, and we destroyed it. Now, facing an invader we cannot defeat by force alone, we are paying to bring that same predator back because we finally understand that it was never the problem. It was part of the answer all along. The fish we exiled is being welcomed home, into a river that needs it more than it ever knew. And it asks for no budget, no contract, no committee. It asks only to be allowed to be what it has always been. That is the quiet miracle unfolding beneath the brown water of the Illinois. Not a war won, but a balance returning. A river that was written off as a battlefield, learning once again to be a living thing that defends itself. The people on the surface will keep spending, keep netting, keep guarding the door to the Great Lakes, and they should. But the most hopeful work is happening where no one can see it. In the deep channels where a 100-pound catfish swallows a silver carp whole. In the southern streams where a young giant, gone for half a century, is growing back into its armor. And in the shadowed backwaters where a fish older than the dinosaurs waits in the weeds, patient as time itself, it strikes. The river remembers what it was, and, given even half a chance, given back the predators we took from it, it is reaching, quietly and without our permission, toward what it could be again.